I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, the ongoing betrayal by European countries which are tolerating blatant anti-Semitism. Recently, Alan Dershowitz, whom you all know, visited Europe to participate in a conference commemorating the 80th anniversary of the publication of Germany's Nuremberg laws, which brutally restricted Jewish life and were a portent of the Shoah, and the 70th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, which put on public display for the world to see and which brought justice to many of those who were part of the Nazis' diabolical and maniacal torture and murder of 6 million Jews, including 1.5 million Jewish children. After his visit, Alan wrote a powerful piece chronicling the vicious anti-Semitism he saw that is part of today's Europe. I'd remind you that Alan Dershowitz is Emeritus Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, has for more than 4 decades been a leading liberal voice on the American scene, championing human and civil rights, constitutional issues, matters of criminal law, and he's become one of the preeminent voices in the world defending the state of Israel and the Jewish people from scurrilous anti-Semitic attacks. Alan is also a most prolific author, having published more than 30 books, the latest of which actually has a very cute, provocative title, Electile Dysfunction, a guide for the unaroused voter. And it's always wonderful to be able to speak to Alan Dershowitz, who's with us right now. Alan, thank you so much for joining us again on JBS.
Well, it's a pleasure. I so much enjoy being with you and getting feedback from your wonderful viewers and listeners.
That's wonderful to hear. Okay, first of all, Alan, tell our viewers, what was the itinerary of your trip through Europe?
Well, I started out in Krakow with my wife and my 26-year-old daughter, who had never been to that part of the world. We participated in a terrific conference with chief justices from all over the world and leading legislatures looking at the impact of the Nuremberg laws and then the Nuremberg trials. It was convened by Erwin Kottler. The 3 co-chairmen was supposed to be Erwin Kottler, me, and Elie Wiesel. Of course, Elie was too ill to participate and passed away tragically just a few weeks after that. It was a wonderful, wonderful event. Then right after that, I took a little tour with my family of the areas that my parents had come from, and grandparents particularly, from Galicia. We went to the towns that my family came from, Tarnów and Pilza, and looked to see whether there were any remnants of my family. We found out some tragic stories of what happened. You talked about children being killed in the Shoah. We found out what happened to a cousin of mine who was a beautiful 15-year-old girl who was taken as a sex slave by the Nazis and then murdered, and then another 16-year-old boy who was a clerk in Auschwitz and was hanged. And so when you learn about that and you're there, it has an enormous impact. And from there we went to Hungary and then to Slovakia and then to Austria. And we saw what is going on in Eastern Europe, which is devastatingly frightening. Mm-hmm. The right wing is coming back. Mm-hmm. The right wing in Poland, for example, has now passed a law, which I have challenged and will challenge again on your show. It is now going to be a crime in Poland to in any way state that Polish people were complicit in the murder of Jews during the Nazi occupation of Poland. So let me state quite unequivocally that Polish people were complicit. They were complicit in the burning of a barn with more than 100 Jewish people in it at the beginning of the occupation, and they were certainly complicit in the killing. They were indeed solely responsible for the killing of many people in the town of Kielce following the end of the Second World War, after the Nazis had left. And Poland is, of course, a mixed picture. There were some brave Polish people, Jan Karski, many others who risked their lives to help Jews. But there were too many, and too many who were centrally involved in the Catholic Church, who were complicit in the killing. The the Catholic Church in Poland historically had been rife with anti-Semitism. Cardinal Golub was a rampant anti-Semite, and many of the other cardinals and primates and priests preached anti-Semitism from the pulpit. And so the Catholic Church of Poland bears considerable responsibility for the role of Poland in the Shoah. From there, we went to Hungary, which is, again, now under the control of right-wing parties, and there are even more extremist right-wing parties, memorials to the Shoah being desecrated on a regular basis. Slovakia is having similar problems. Austria came very close to electing as president an extreme right-wing leader. So we're seeing not a repeat of what happened, certainly not in the 1930s, but we're seeing a movement backward from the kind of centrism and liberalism that followed the end of communism, and it's frightening. We're seeing even worse in the West, because in the West, the anti-Semitism is coming from the left, is coming from the academy, is coming from intellectuals, is coming from students, and it parades as anti-Zionism, but at its core, it's deep hatred for the Jewish people and the nation state of the Jewish people.
By the way, Alan, you mentioned in your piece that after the Shoah, there was a sense that this could never happen again in Europe, that Europe would never have this kind of anti-Semitism that you're talking about. And you reflect upon that in your piece. Speak to that right now. How do you imagine it is that it's only 70 years later that all of a sudden there is a chilling, it may not be the same, but there's a chilling form of anti-Semitism throughout much of Europe.
Yeah, and it's because there was a moratorium on anti-Semitism in the generation that was complicit in the Holocaust. There was a lot of guilt. By the way, it was guilt that should have been very widespread. Through Holland, where there was great complicity, we always hear a wonderful thing about the Dutch people. Many of them were terrible. They were Nazis. We have it all over Europe. There wasn't a single country that was immune from it. It was to a far lesser degree in countries like Bulgaria and some other countries, and in Italy. But every country had some of it. And now we have the great-grandchildren of the perpetrators, and they've forgotten, and they don't feel guilty. And they're going back to the old ways. It's no longer religiously based anti-Semitism in many parts of the world. And in Poland, it's partly religiously based anti-Semitism. But in the Western Europe, certainly it isn't, because religion is essentially plays a very small role, particularly among Christians in Western Europe. Islamic anti-Semitism is rampant in Western Europe. And let's also expose another myth. We always hear the extreme statements on both sides. Oh, Muslims are terrorists. That's a terrible thing to say. The vast majority of Muslims are peace-loving people who hate terrorism, but there is a very substantial number of Muslims who are anti-Semitic, very substantial number, in the hundreds of millions. And there are tens of millions of Muslims who support terrorism when directed against the nation state of the Jewish people. So just because only a small fraction of Muslims actually participate in terrorism doesn't give the general population of Islam a pass. Too many of them are anti-Semitic in places like England and France and Holland and Germany and Turkey. So we're seeing anti-Semitism coming from many Muslims, from some Christians, and from many atheists and agnostics on the hard left who disguise their anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism. Now we're seeing it in the United States, coming from Black Lives Matter, from Code Pink, from Move On, from many of the groups that call themselves progressives in America, but they are not progressives, they're repressives. They are trying to stifle debate and stifle dissent. Black Lives Matter says we don't want white people participating in the liberation of black people. They claim that Israel is a genocidal and apartheid country. And we have to fight back, and we cannot remain silent or complicit in the evil of anti-Semitism, even when perpetrated by groups who do some good things.
Alan, you also write about your travels from Poland, which you call in your piece the old hell, to Hungary, which you call the new hell. What did you mean?
Well, Hungary has always had a mixed history. The Hungarian Jews in Budapest and in other parts of Hungary did very well. They were very assimilated. They were accepted. There was always anti-Semitism, of course. When the war began, even before the Nazis began to kill the Jews, there was Nazi movements within Hungary that wanted to kill the Jews. And then, of course, one of the greatest tragedies of the Shoah is that there was not enough warning to the Jews of Hungary to try to escape, to try to hide in the countryside. Elie Wiesel wrote brilliantly about it in Night and in others of his books, and blamed many of the Jewish leaders for not providing that kind of warning. I guess the worst example of that was on the island of Rhodes. People don't realize that the island of Rhodes had a substantial Jewish community from the Babylonian exile. We're talking about thousands of years. And Rhodes is only a very short distance from Turkey, which was a neutral country. And yet, when the Nazis marched into Rhodes with only a very small number of soldiers, they were able to take virtually every Jew who lived in Rhodes, put them on ferries, and then put them on trains, transport them to Auschwitz, and kill them all. And these were not wealthy Jews. These were tradesmen who had lived in Rhodes for so many years. The stories of what could have been done and what should have been done to save the Jews during the Shoah is something that we always have to repeat to avoid repeating the history that we confronted.
Okay. Alan, you draw a conclusion at the end of your piece about the state of Israel. I wish you would talk about that for a moment.
Well, there's never been a more important time for there to be a nation state for the Jewish people. There has to be a default. There has to be a place where Jews can go if they're not welcome elsewhere. Amos Oz wrote poignantly in his book, A Tale of Darkness, that when his father was living in, I think, Latvia, I can't remember, but one of those countries, the signs on the wall were Jews out of here, go to Palestine. And now the signs on the wall are Jews out of Palestine, go back to Europe.
Yes.
And today there is no place for Jews in many parts of Europe. If I had a friend or a relative who wanted to make their life in Europe today, I would say no. Fortunately, there is place for Jews in America, in Canada, in Australia, in many other parts of the world. But Europe is becoming very difficult. Fortunately, we do have Israel, and we're seeing increased aliyah from countries like France to Israel, and we're going to see more of it in many parts of Europe. So there's never been a more important time for the law of return, which is a just law, giving preference to people of Jewish heritage and background. And I'm proud of Israel for having such a law. By the way, many countries have such laws, including the Palestinian Authority, but only Israel gets criticized for having law of return. It's the country that needs it most because Jews are still being persecuted in many, many parts of the world, and the situation does not seem to be abating or improving.
Mm-hmm. I find it a terrible shame that Jews may be actually no longer at home in Europe. And of course, you do speak about the importance of Israel in that context. And you make a very good point that it's not only Israel, but it's that where Jews are welcome. But it is amazing to me, Alan, it's staggering to me that we may come to a time when European Jewry is no longer a living, vibrant piece of the Jewish community.
I think that's possible, and it's certainly happened already in much of Eastern Europe. But what I worry about, too, is that Jews are no longer welcome on many American university campuses.
Mm-hmm.
I have a piece that I wrote just this week about how progressive groups on campus are having a litmus test for Jews. If you're Jewish, you have to renounce Israel. Otherwise, you can't support the environment, you can't support gay rights, you can't support women's rights, you can't support black rights. Unless you're willing to renounce Israel, you're not part of the, quote, progressive movement. This is a deliberate attempt to try to get Jews out of the progressive movement or else turn them into anti-Zionists. And hopefully it won't work. Hopefully Jewish students will fight back and argue against this absurd notion of intersectionality, which is the phoniest academic claim that all oppressed groups, except Jews, all oppressed groups in the world have the same common oppressors, namely America, Israel, Western democracies. It's extremely anti-democratic, anti-Western, but it's catching on college campuses. And when you get and read the disgrace that George Soros, who is one of the most evil men in the world today, from everything I can see, has been contributing to Black Lives Matter at a time when Black Lives Matter is calling Israel genocidal and apartheid. And to see that the Ford Foundation has contributed many, many tens of millions of dollars to Black Lives Matter, which is pushing an anti-Israel and overtly anti-Semitic platform, I think that begins to show that Israel is once again the canary in the coal mine.
Yes.
And we have a great deal to worry about in America. And we have to fight this at the very beginning. We cannot allow Black Lives Matter or other anti-Israel and anti-Semitic organizations to hide behind the fact that there is racism in America, as there is in every country in the world, that there are police abuses, as there are in many countries in the world, much worse in South America and other countries than in the United States. And we can't allow anti-Semitism to hide behind good programs and decent programs. Every decent person, Jew and non-Jew, must totally disassociate themselves from any organization that declares Israel to be genocidal or apartheid or tries to delegitimate or argue against the existence of the nation state of the Jewish people. We have to draw a line in the sand. We have to be tough. We have to fight back. And we have to not be exposed to the guilt that people say, oh, if you don't support Black Lives Matter, you're a racist. No, I am not a racist. I do not support Black Lives Matter. I will continue to fight against Black Lives Matter until they remove that false blood libel of genocide from their platform. How dare you call me a racist when you, Black Lives Matter, are engaging in the worst form of the oldest bigotry, anti-Semitism.
Fabulous, Alan.
Well,
I want to
add that there are very good people in Black Lives Matter.
I understand.
People who are naive, who don't know,
I understand.
don't understand, and I don't criticize them. But
I understand.
I'm trying to educate them. Now they know, and they have no excuse.
Yes. I want to ask a related issue. I don't know if you saw that in today's New York Times, Nicholas Kristof has an op-ed piece in which he compares a Syrian child to Anne Frank. And his last line reads, "Today, to our shame, Anne Frank is a Syrian girl." What's your reaction to Kristof's comparing Anne Frank to the children in Syria who are also at the moment being brutalized?
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised. Kristof has had a long history of lack of sympathy for Israel and the Jewish people, and he uses the Shoah to make a point. Of course, there's no comparison. The young people, the children of Syria, aren't being targeted because they're Syrians or because they're Muslims. They are in the way. They are being killed because there's a war going on. There is no comparison between what the Nazis did to Jewish children. It wasn't that Jewish children were in the way. They brought Jewish children in from Rhodes, thousands of miles away, to kill them. They brought them in from every far-flung corner of every land they conquered in order to kill them. So there is no comparison between what happened to Anne Frank and more than 1 million Jewish children and tragically what's happening in Syria. He tries to make the point that the comparison is between the fact that America wouldn't open its doors to Jewish immigrants and they won't open their doors to Syrian immigrants. But even there's a difference. Yes, there were bigots in America who claimed that Jewish refugees might be communists or fascists or dangerous spies, but nobody believed that, really. That was an excuse. Jews posed no danger whatsoever to America, whereas there is a danger posed by some radical extremists from Islam who would come under the cover of being refugees. We see that in Europe. We're seeing in Europe that some of the terrorism and some of the attacks and assaults on women are coming from people who escaped Syria or claim to have escaped Syria and use the cover of refugee status to engage in acts of terrorism. One should never make comparisons to the Shoah. The Shoah is unique, tragically, in world history. And every comparison to the Shoah is always going to be deeply flawed and is generally motivated by ill intention. I don't look to the motives of Christoph, who writes some very, very good and some very, very bad articles. But I think that making a comparison to the Holocaust, comparing Anne Frank to the Syrian girl, is ahistorical, amoral, and simply wrong.
You know, I so much love having you on JBS. I have to tell you, Alan, I watch you sometimes on other American television channels. I'm always jealous. I know you must go on, you should be going on everywhere. What I am aware of is, except in rare circumstances, you're given, 3 minutes.
Right.
And I love the fact that when you come on JBS, you really have the time to express yourself in a cogent, thoughtful way, and it's just wonderful. So, Alan, why did you write your latest book? Raise it up, Alan. You have it with you. Electile Dysfunction.
I literally got the first copies today. It's called Electile Dysfunction.
Electile Dysfunction, a guide for the unaroused voter. Alan, who are you writing for whom you believe may be politically unaroused?
I'm writing for the majority of Americans who are not excited about either candidate. Most Americans are going to vote against the candidate, not for a candidate in this election.
Absolutely.
Many Americans are going to stay home. We've never seen a situation where both candidates have so many negatives. So I'm writing this book to urge everybody to vote, for one of the two candidates, not to vote for a third party. Jill Stein is an abomination. She's a virulent anti-Semite. She's Jewish, but that doesn't surprise anybody. She is one of these people who says you can't support the environment unless you oppose Israel and delegitimate Israel and engage in boycotts against Israel. So I hope nobody will vote for Jill Stein, and I hope she'll disappear into the wastebasket garbage pail of history. But Johnson and Weld are substantial candidates, but some people are going to vote for them. I've urged people to vote only for one of the two major candidates. This election is too important to be determined by default. I also write about what's going on in Europe and what's going on in terms of extremism around the world and why we need a centrist president of the United States to bring stability to the world. The book will be available generally right after Labor Day. You can get it on Amazon, or you can get it on Kindle. It's also an ebook because I wrote it in 3 weeks.
Yeah, I was wondering how quickly you put this book out, Alan. 3 weeks you did this?
I wrote it in 3 weeks, and I finished it about 10 days ago. And it's amazing what they can do with publication now. 10 days ago, this was just a manuscript, and now, here it is, a hardcover book,
right,
beautifully bound with, very nice. And they did it in 10 days. This is Rosetta Books, which are miracle workers. From the time I finished the book, they can get it as an ebook within 2 or 3 days, and within
Amazing.
10 days, they can get it distributed.
Amazing. Just out of curiosity, your last book was Abraham, the First but Not the Last Jewish Lawyer. How long did that take you to write?
No, that took me longer because I did a lot of research on that. I wanted to see how Abraham is viewed in Islam, in Christianity. Obviously, I knew a great deal about how Abraham was viewed within Judaism. And then, of course, I had to do research on lawyers, Jewish lawyers around the world, and see how many of them basically followed in the footsteps of Avraham Avinu, of the first Jewish lawyer, Abraham, the first Zionist who made Aliyah, come up to a country, a new country. The first Jewish immigrant who changed his name, obviously the way many immigrants do. He changed his name from Avram to Avraham, putting God's name in the middle of his name. So I had a lot of fun writing that book. It brought me back to my days in the yeshiva when I was getting C minuses. I remember one grade in yeshiva, I got a Bain Oni minus, which means I didn't quite make it to mediocrity. I had a mediocrity minus. At least I had something to aspire to. And I finally made it to mediocrity in yeshiva, but I never got beyond mediocrity.
Oh, it's fabulous. By the way, Alan, we read that you are working with Hillary Clinton in her preparations for the upcoming debates, that you're playing the role of Donald Trump. What's that been like for you?
No, it shows you not to believe what you read in the media. So it was a radio report, and I immediately told everybody who called me that they haven't called me. I would be willing to do it if they asked, but they haven't asked. So it's not a true report, but it's fun to think of how I would try to imitate the Donald. I've met him on a couple of occasions. As a person, I actually like him, but I am supporting Hillary Clinton.
Of course.
I've known her for years and years and years, and I do think we need a more centrist, moderate leader in the White House, but I'm not here to promote a candidate. I'll have opportunities to do that during the campaign season.
Okay. One last question. You mentioned that the conference you went to with your daughter and your wife, it was supposed to be chaired by Erwin Kotler, yourself, and by Elie Wiesel. You and I have not spoken since Elie's passing. You knew him well. Could you reflect for a moment on who he was and why he may be one of the most important figures of the the second half of the 20th century into the 21st century?
I certainly agree with that. He's certainly one of the half a dozen people who had the most influence on my own life. I first met him when he wrote his book, The Jews of Silence, about Soviet Jewry, and he inspired me to go to the Soviet Union and represent Jewish dissidents from Sharansky to many, many, many others. And we remained close, both politically and personally, literally till just before his death. The last time I saw him was at Carnegie Hall, listening to the great pianist Evgeny Kissin. I actually introduced the two of them, and the three of us spent some time together at Carnegie Hall at a dinner following the opening night.
Oh, wonderful.
And it was the last time that I spent time with him. I then, of course, went to the Shiva and spent some time with his marvelous wife, Marianne, and his son. And I intend to remain in close touch with his family and to never, ever forget his legacy and to never forget the influence he had on me and my generation of Jews to keep us very positively focused on Judaism, on human rights, and to understand that there's no conflict between being a strong supporter of human rights and a proud and strong advocate for Jewish values, for the nation state of the Jewish people. So Elie Wiesel will always be in my mind and always be part of my conscience.
Beautifully said. Alan, you know how much I appreciate always that you give me some time and share your views and your thoughts and your insights with the JBS audience. I hope you have a very nice end of the summer. Good luck with electile dysfunction, and you and I will speak again very soon. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to that. Thank you.
Thank you. The thoughts of Alan Dershowitz, whose new book is entitled Electile Dysfunction, A Guide for the Unaroused Voter. By the way, in reference to the Nicholas Kristof piece in the New York Times, I can understand someone arguing that the United States should be a welcoming haven to every child who lives in a war zone. But there's a world of difference between children in a war zone and who and what Anne Frank symbolizes and was as a victim of the most barbaric evil ever purposefully inflicted on other human beings. And you heard Alan speak to that as well. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, editor, Dennis Golan, JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.